Tonight, we explore the life and legacy of Gaius Julius Caesar, Rome's most iconic leader, general, and visionary. A man whose ambition, charisma, military genius would redefine the Roman Republic and pave the way for an empire that would last for centuries. From conquering Gaul to crossing the Rubicon, from political brilliance to betrayal by those he once called friends. Caesar's story is one of power, passion, and a tragic fall that echoes through history. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. And let us know in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting and we reworking on some boring ones just to balance things out. Now it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some background noise, and dive into what we've prepared for you tonight together. Julius Caesar entered the world on a warm day in July in the year 100 BCE, beneath the golden skies of ancient Rome. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar, was one already respected. But no one could have guessed the boy born into that modest household would become the man who would forever reshape the Roman world. He came from the James Julia, an old patrician family that traced its roots back to the goddess Venus herself, or so legend claimed. Noble blood, yes, but not wealthy. By the time Caesar was born, the Julii had lost much of their fortune. His father, also named Gaius, held a local position of power, and his mother, Aurelia, a strong and intelligent woman, would play an even more pivotal role in shaping her son's future. Young Caesar was raised with discipline and ambition. From a young age, he showed a sharp mind and a natural charm. But it was a dangerous time to grow up in Rome. Civil wars, power struggles, and political purges dominated the streets. Rome was a republic in name, but in practice, it was a brutal arena of ambition where alliances crumbled and friends became foes overnight. When Caesar was just 16, his father suddenly died. That meant Caesar became the head of the household, a heavy burden for a teenage boy. Around this time, Rome was ruled by a ruthless dictator, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a general who saw enemies everywhere. And Caesar, through no fault of his own, was tied to one of them. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of Sulla's rival, Esse. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce her. Refusing meant risking his life, but Caesar refused anyway. That single act of defiance could have ended him. Instead, it defined him. To survive, he went into hiding, constantly moving, constantly watched. And yet, Sulla, impressed by something in the young man's eyes, eventually spared him. Years later, Sulla would mutter almost as a warning, "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." He meant that in Caesar there was danger, ambition, potential, and he was right. The boy who once hid from soldiers would one day command legions. But for now, he was just getting started. After surviving Sulla's dictatorship, young Caesar re-entered Roman life with a sharpened instinct for survival and a hunger for something more. He understood, even as a young man, that Rome was a game of ambition. To win, you needed allies, timing, and nerves of steel. Caesar had all three, but first, he needed experience. He joined the military, serving in Asia Minor and earning the civic crown, a high honor for bravery in battle. His time in the field showed him what real power looked like, and he wanted it. But adventure, as always, seemed to find Caesar. While sailing the Ion Sea, he was captured by Cilician pirates. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed. "You don't know who I am," he told them. "Ask for 50. They did. For weeks, he lived among them, joking, writing poetry, and promising in good humor that once he was free, he'd return and crucify them. They thought he was playing. He wasn't. After his ransom was paid, Caesar raised a private fleet, hunted the pirates down, and kept his word. But in a rare gesture of mercy, he slit their throats before crucifying them so they wouldn't suffer. That story spread through Rome. It was bold. It was brutal. It was Caesar, back in Rome. He quickly climbed the political ladder. first as a lawyer known for his passionate speeches, and then as an elected official. But Rome was still dangerous, divided between two great forces: the conservative elite known as the Optimates and the populists called the Popular. Caesar, ever the strategist, sided with the people. He aligned himself with the memory of Marius, his uncle, by marriage, who had once championed the commoners. This made the aristocrats uneasy. Caesar, with his fine clothes, sharp words, and growing popularity, was becoming a threat. He took on the role of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, a position of immense influence. He gained power without using a sword, but he knew that day would come. Caesar understood that politics in Rome wasn't just about speeches or Senate votes. It was about image, control, and timing. He was building his name carefully, quietly. And soon he would make a move that would shake the Republic to its core. By the late 60s BCE, Caesar had become a rising force in Roman politics. But he wasn't alone. The Roman Republic was bursting at the seams. Its Senate was divided, its people restless. Powerful men were circling each other like wolves, each waiting to make their move. Among them stood Pomp the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Gras, the wealthiest man the city had ever known. Both had influence, both had enemies, and both were growing frustrated with the Senate's refusal to grant them what they wanted. Caesar saw an opportunity not just for himself, but for all three. In 60 BCE, he orchestrated a private agreement, a secret partnership that historians would later call the First Triumvirate. It wasn't a legal body or an official alliance. It was simply three ambitious men agreeing to support one another against their rivals. Pompey wanted land for his soldiers. Croesus wanted financial reforms for his business allies. Caesar, he wanted the consulship, Rome's highest elected office. With their backing, he won. Once in office, Caesar wasted no time. He pushed through land reforms, honored his part of the deal with Pompey and Cassius, and worked around the Senate's resistance by appealing directly to the public. He knew how to speak to crowds. He knew how to perform power. But even that wasn't enough. Caesar arranged to be appointed governor of Gaul, a vast and largely unconquered region stretching across a modern-day France and Belgium. It was a military command with enormous potential, both for glory and for gold. While others saw Gaul as a dangerous frontier, Caesar saw it as a stage. He was now more than just a politician. He was about to become a general, and with that he would gain something more powerful than speeches or Senate votes: an army loyal to him. As he prepared to leave Rome, many underestimated him. To them, Caesar was still just a clever manipulator, a man of ambition, yes, but not of war. They had no idea what was coming. Gaul would change Caesar. It would transform him from a rising star into a living legend. And for Rome, it would be the beginning of the end. When Julius Caesar took command of Gaul in 58 BCE, few in Rome understood what he was about to do. Some saw it as a distant post, others as a political vacation. But Caesar didn't see Gaul as a duty. He saw it as a destiny. The GIC tribes were fierce, independent, and far from united. Caesar exploited that. He used diplomacy where he could and overwhelming force where he couldn't. Over the next 8 years, he led campaign after campaign, slowly bringing the wild frontiers under Roman control. He crossed rivers, marched through mountain passes, and led his troops through brutal winters. He crushed rebellions, formed temporary alliances, and wrote letters back to Rome. His famous commentary Dio describing the events. But these weren't just reports. They were propaganda crafted to shape his public image and keep his name alive in Roman minds. Caesar's men loved him. He shared in their hardships. He paid them generously, praised their courage, and never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He was more than a general. He was a symbol. One of his greatest challenges came in 52 CE, when a GIC chieftain named Vercingetorix united the tribes against Rome. It was a final stand. Caesar pursued him across the land, eventually trapping him at Alesia, a fortress on a hill surrounded by Roman walls. What followed was one of the most brilliant sieges in ancient history. Outnumbered and nearly starved, Caesar and his forces built a second wall, facing outward to hold off a Greek relief army. Two armies attacked from two directions, but Caesar held his ground. When the battle ended, Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul was effectively Rome's. Back home, Caesar was a hero to the people, but a growing threat to the Senate. His fame, his wealth, and most dangerously, his loyal army gave him more power than any Roman had held in generations. And though his campaigns in Gaul were over, Caesar knew one truth: he couldn't return to Rome as an ordinary man. The Senate would strip him of his command, maybe even prosecute him. So once again, Julius Caesar began to plan. His next move would decide the fate of Rome itself. By 50 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the edge of a choice, one that would echo across history. His conquest of Gaul had made him the most powerful man in Rome. But that power existed outside the city's walls. According to Roman law, a general had to relinquish command of his army before re-entering Italy. He would then become an ordinary citizen, vulnerable to arrest, prosecution, or worse. The Senate, now firmly under the influence of Pompey, Caesar's former ally turned rival, ordered him to disband his legions and return home. It wasn't a request, it was a trap. Caesar knew if he returned without his army, he'd be politically ruined, perhaps even killed. So he made his decision. On a cold January evening in 49 BCE, Caesar stood beside a shallow river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. It was a legal boundary. To cross it with an army was treason. But with one quiet step into the water, Caesar broke the law and sealed his fate. He is said to have whispered, "Alla est," the dice cast. Rome trembled. News of the crossing spread like wildfire. Panic seized the city. Senators fled. Pompey fled. The great general, once thought invincible, left Rome without a fight. Caesar marched south, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. At least, that's how he framed it. But this was no peaceful transition. It was the beginning of a civil war. Over the next year, Caesar moved quickly. He secured Italy, marched into Spain, and defeated Pompey's forces there. Then he crossed the sea into Greece to face Pompey himself. The showdown came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's discipline and strategy won the day. Pompey fled once more, this time to Egypt, where he was murdered before Caesar could reach him. When Caesar arrived and saw Pompey's severed head, he is said to have wept. It was not the death he had wanted for his old ally, his rival, and once his son-in-law. Still, the war wasn't over. Enemies remained. But Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, not only in body, but in destiny. He could never go back to the old republic, and he had no intention of trying. After the brutal clash at Pharsalus and the sorrowful death of Pompey, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, the dazzling heart of Egypt. But instead of peace, he walked into another storm. A civil war between two royal siblings, Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy the Saracen. Cleopatra was clever, ambitious, and radiant. She understood politics just as well as Caesar did. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the palace rolled inside a carpet, which was unrolled before Caesar's feet. Whether myth or truth, the moment marked the beginning of a powerful and intimate alliance. Caesar chose her side. The decision wasn't just about attraction, it was strategy. Egypt was rich. Its grain-fed Rome and Cleopatra offered stability, but supporting her meant war. Ptolemy's forces surrounded Caesar in Alexandria. What followed was a fierce and unexpected battle, the Siege of Alexandria. Despite being outnumbered and in foreign land, Caesar's tactics held firm. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy drowned while fleeing across the Nile, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne. Now ruling beside her younger brother as co-ruler, but with real power in her hands. Caesar stayed in Egypt for months. He and Cleopatra traveled together along the Nile, exploring ancient temples and marvels of a civilization even older than Rome. In time, she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar ever officially acknowledged him remains debated, but the bond between them was real. Still, Caesar could not stay forever. The Roman world still burned. He left Egypt, not just with an ally, but with a new sense of imperial possibility. He had seen what it meant to rule like a god-king, and that vision may have planted a seed, one that would blossom into his later ambitions, but trouble awaited him. In Asia Minor, a rebellion had broken out. Caesar crushed it quickly, so quickly in fact that he sent back a now famous message to Rome. Veni vidi vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He was no longer just a general. He was becoming a symbol, a force of nature. And back in Rome, that force was heading home toward even greater power and toward even greater danger. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome, it wasn't as a returning servant of the Republic. It was as its uncontested master. The civil war was not yet fully over, but Caesar had already been declared dictator for 10 years, and then soon after, dictator for life. These were titles that alarmed many Romans. Their republic, built on the idea that no one man should hold too much power, was now in the hands of one. Still, Caesar set to work. He had a vision, a Rome rebuilt and reformed. He passed laws to ease debt, offered land to veterans, expanded the Senate to include people from across the empire, and most famously introduced a new calendar, the Julian calendar, which still echoes in the one we use today. But with every reform, the old god grew more unsettled. Caesar had begun acting like a king, even though Rome had sworn off kings for centuries. He wore purple robes, the color of royalty. His face appeared on coins, something never done while a Roman was still alive. He accepted honors, built statues of himself, and even refused to rise when senators came to greet him, an unmistakable sign of superiority. And then came the most dangerous moment of all, the crown. During the festival of Lupercalia, before a large crowd, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, offered him a golden crown. 3 times he held it out. 3 times Caesar refused. To the people, it was proof that Caesar respected the Republic. To the Senate, it felt like theater, a trial run to gauge public reaction. Behind the marble columns of the Senate House, whispers began to rise. Was Caesar planning to declare himself king? Had he already become one in all but name? Could Rome, the eternal republic, survive under one man's rule? Some senators believed the answer was no, and they began to plot. But Caesar, perhaps too confident, too trusting, or simply too proud, didn't see the danger. Or perhaps he did, and believed himself untouchable. He had risen higher than any Roman before him. But in doing so, he had walked the knife's edge between admiration and fear. And soon that fear would take form in steel and betrayal. The warnings had been there, subtle at first, then increasingly bold. Soothsayers spoke of danger. One famously told Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March, the 15th day of the Roman month." But Caesar, ever defiant, brushed it off with a smile. He believed in fate, but more so, he believed in himself. And so the Ides of March arrived. It was the year 44 B.C.E., and Caesar had just returned from yet another campaign. He was preparing for a new war, this time against the Parthians. But first, he attended to business in Rome. That morning, his wife Calpurnia begged him not to go to the Senate. She had dreamt of his statue pouring blood and crowds of Romans washing their hands in it. The signs were unmistakable, but Caesar, either out of confidence or exhaustion, chose to ignore them. At around midday, Caesar walked to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. It was a place heavy with symbolism, named after his former ally, then enemy, now long dead. A fitting stage for the final act. As he entered the hall, senators surrounded him. At first, it was conversation. Then it turned to chaos. One man grabbed Caesar's toga. Another struck him with a dagger. Then another, then another. The air filled with gasps, shouts, and steel. Caesar fought back for a moment until he saw a familiar face. Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus wasn't just a senator. He was someone Caesar had trusted, even loved. Some sources say Brutus may have been like a son to him. And when Caesar saw him raise the knife, he stopped resisting. According to legend, he whispered not in Latin, but in Greek. Kaisu teknon, you too, my child. With that, Caesar fell. He was stabbed 23 times, though only one wound was truly fatal. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic. They thought the people would thank them, but instead, Rome froze. The streets did not celebrate. The people mourned, and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, would soon turn the tide with a fiery speech that lit the flame of vengeance. The knife had ended a life, but not the legacy. Julius Caesar was gone, but Rome was far from saved. His assassination, meant to restore the Republic, had the opposite effect. Instead of peace, it plunged the city into chaos. Crowds wept at the sight of his body. Shops closed. The Senate grew silent. Rome held its breath, unsure of what would come next. And then the tide shifted. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony stepped forward, not as a general, but as a grieving friend. His eulogy, filled with emotion and rage, ignited the people. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing that Caesar had left money to every citizen and donated land to the public. He had thought of them, even in death. The crowd erupted. What had begun as a political murder was now seen as a betrayal of the people's champion. But the real twist came next. In his will, Caesar had named a young relative, Gaius Octavius, his 18-year-old great-nephew, as his adopted son and legal heir. The boy became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and later simply Augustus. Together with Mark Antony, Octavian formed the Second Triumvirate, hunting down Caesar's assassins across the empire. Brutus and Cassius, leaders of the conspiracy, would die by their own hands after defeat in battle. Justice, at least in Roman terms, was served. But even this alliance would not last. Antony, drawn to Cleopatra and Egypt, began drifting from Rome. Octavian used it to his advantage, declaring war on Antony and Cleopatra. In 31 CE, at the Battle of Actium, their forces were crushed. Soon after, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. The last resistance had fallen. With no rivals left, Octavian became the first emperor of Rome. The Republic, in name only now, was gone. But Caesar's legacy lived on. The title Caesar became more than a name. It became a symbol of imperial power. It would echo in history through emperors like Tiberius, Nero, and Constantine. It would stretch beyond Rome into the words Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia. Julius Caesar had changed the world, not just through war or politics, but through the force of his will. He lived as a man, ruled like a legend, and died as a symbol. And even now, over 2,000 years later, we still tell his story. Before the first shot was ever fired, the seeds of division had already taken root. In the early 1800s, the United States was a young nation stretching its arms westward, full of promise, ambition, and contradictions. The North evolved into a hub of industry, commerce, and innovation. Cities grew, railroads expanded. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, chasing opportunity in factories and shops. But the South moved to a different rhythm. Its wealth rested on agriculture, vast cotton fields worked by the labor of enslaved people. The plantation system depended not just on land, but on the idea that some human beings could be owned. This divide wasn't just economic, it was cultural, moral, and deeply political. The North began to lean toward abolitionist thinking, calling slavery a sin that had to end. The South defended it as a way of life, an institution protected by law and by profit. And as new territories were added to the country, places like Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, and California, a burning question surfaced again and again. Would these new states allow slavery or ban it? Each new answer pulled the country further apart. Compromises were made, temporary bandages over a widening wound. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each tried to balance power between free and slave states, but none addressed the root conflict. In 1854, violence broke out in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed. It was called Bleeding Kansas, a preview of what was coming. Tensions spilled into Congress, too. In 1856, Senator from South Carolina beat a fellow senator unconscious on the Senate floor with a cane because of a speech condemning slavery. America wasn't just arguing anymore, it was tearing. Then came the presidential election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. To the South, this wasn't just a political loss, it was a sign that their influence and their way of life was dying. In December of that same year, South Carolina seceded from the Union. One by one, 10 more states followed. What had begun as a nation of compromise and ideals was now on the edge of war, and the cracks in the Union had become a fracture. The ink had barely dried on Abraham Lincoln's election when the break began. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina voted to secede from the United States. One by one, 10 more Southern states followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. These states declared they were no longer part of the Union. They formed a new country, the Confederate States of America. Their argument was built on one word: sovereignty. The right they claimed for each state to govern itself, including the right to protect slavery. To them, Lincoln's presidency represented a threat. Not because he promised to abolish slavery everywhere, but because he opposed its expansion. They feared the balance of power had shifted permanently to the North. In February 1861, Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, was elected as the President of the Confederacy. They adopted their own constitution, closely modeled after the U.S. Constitution, but with explicit protections for slavery. Back in Washington, President Lincoln faced a paralyzing crisis. Legally, no provision allowed states to secede, but the Constitution offered no clear path forward either. Could a country survive if its members simply walked away? Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government. In his first inaugural address, he spoke not with anger, but with sorrow. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But words alone could not hold the Union together. Then came April 12, 1861. At Fort Sumter, a Union-held garrison in Charleston Harbor. South Carolina forces demanded surrender. When the U.S. troops refused, Confederate cannons opened fire. Smoke filled the air. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. The Union soldiers eventually surrendered. No one died in the bombardment, but the line had been crossed. News spread quickly. Shock turned to resolve. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. In the South, that call was seen as an act of war, and 4 more states seceded. The country had divided, not in theory, not in debate, but in fire, flags, and armies. The United States was no longer united, and the Civil War had officially begun. The war that followed wasn't fought only on distant battlefields. It was fought in living rooms, in letters, in hearts. This was a conflict that divided families. Sons chose opposite sides. Cousins met on the same field. One wearing blue, the other gray. Ministers blessed soldiers on both sides of the line. Friends who once shared childhood laughter now faced each other through rifle sights. That's why the Civil War was often called a war of brother against brother. And in many cases, it literally was. In the border states especially, families were torn in two. In Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, neighbors flew different flags. Towns were split down the middle. Loyalty became dangerous. Trust was fragile. And through all of it, there were the letters written by flickering candlelight on paper, smudged with dirt or stained with rain. Soldiers sent words home, tiny fragments of hope and memory. A Confederate soldier wrote to his wife, "I held the hand of a dying boy today. He called for his mother. I thought of you. I still carry your last letter tucked near my heart." A Union soldier, barely 19, wrote to his younger sister, "I miss the farm. I miss the smell of spring. If I don't return, know that I marched with honor and thought of home every step." Many of these letters never reached their destinations. Mail carriers were often captured, killed, or lost in the chaos. And yet soldiers kept writing. Words became survival, a way to remember who they were before the guns, a way to remind someone somewhere that they were still alive. For those back home, the war brought its own form of pain. Women waited by windows, by porches, by fields. Children grew up without fathers. Parents opened envelopes with trembling hands, afraid of what news might spill out. Every knock on the door could bring relief or ruin. And all the while, the war machine pressed on. Armies swelled. Camps spread across hills and forests. The sound of drums replaced the sound of birds. This wasn't just a battle between governments. It was a tearing of human bonds. And still, the worst was yet to come. At first, many believed the war would be short. Some thought it would last a few weeks, perhaps one decisive battle, and then peace. Young men rushed to enlist, eager for glory. Spectators even brought picnic baskets to the hills outside the first major battle, expecting a grand show. They were wrong. The First Battle of Bull Run, fought in July 1861 near Manassas, Virginia, shattered all illusions. Union and Confederate forces clashed in a chaotic and brutal fight. It ended with Union troops retreating in disarray and the realization that this war would not be quick or clean. The name Stonewall Jackson was born that day, a Confederate general who stood firm as his men rallied. His name became legend. But for every moment of heroism, there were hundreds of moments of terror. Bodies lined the fields. Men cried out for water, for home, for mercy. Then came Wilson's Creek, Ball's Bluff, Fort Donald Elson, and Shiloh. Each battle brought more blood. More names etched into history and into headstones. At Shiloh in the spring of 1862, over 23,000 men were killed or wounded in just 2 days. The ground turned to mud from the rain and the blood. Soldiers lay among shattered trees and broken cannons, many of them too wounded to cry. General Ulysses Schrent, leading the Union forces, was shaken. He wrote, "I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest." The war was no longer about defense or quick victory. It had become a grind, a slow, merciless struggle to outlast the other side. In the background, technology advanced. Railroads moved troops faster than ever before. The telegraph delivered battlefield news in near real time. Rifled muskets and ironclad ships changed how war was fought. It was the modern world's first taste of industrial warfare. Yet through all the tactics and inventions, it was still fought by men, ordinary, frightened. Brave men who marched through fog and forests, unsure if they would ever march back. As 1862 faded into 1863, the war had consumed thousands of lives and scarred hundreds of towns. And still, the fighting continued, because both sides still believed they could win. By the fall of 1862, the war had reached a fever pitch. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, confident after victories in the South, made a daring move. He took the fight into Union territory. His army crossed into Maryland, hoping a victory there would deepen international support toward the Confederacy and perhaps even end the war. But the Union Army under General George McClellan intercepted Lee's plans. The two forces met near a quiet stream called Antietam Creek, just outside Sharpsburg, Maryland. On September 17, 1862, the fields of Antietam turned red. At dawn, Union forces attacked the Confederate left flank. The battle moved from cornfields to sunken roads, from stone bridges to open hills. Musket smoke clouded the sky. Soldiers fired blindly through the fog of war. Entire regiments were cut down in minutes. At the Bloody Lane, a sunken farm road. Thousands of men died in hand-to-hand combat. The road, once used by wagons and farmers, became a trench of bodies. By midday, the creek stone bridge became another flashpoint. Union soldiers charged again and again, only to fall back under heavy Confederate fire. Eventually, they crossed, but at an unbearable cost. By nightfall, the guns fell silent. In just 12 hours, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. No ground was truly gained. No army decisively won. But Lee retreated, and the Union claimed it as a victory. President Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for this moment. With the Confederates pushed back, he released the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in rebelling states would be free. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now about freedom. Europe watched closely. Any chance of Britain or France supporting the Confederacy began to fade. Lincoln's proclamation reframed the conflict and added moral weight to the Union cause. But the soldiers who fought at Antietam weren't thinking about proclamations. They remembered the screams, the silence, the crows circling overhead. Antietam was a turning point, not just in strategy, but in soul. By the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee was bold once again. After victories in Virginia, he led his Confederate army north into Pennsylvania. His goal was simple: bring the war into Union territory. Shake the North's will to fight and force a political solution. But the Union Army, now under General George Meade, followed closely behind. They met near a small town called Gettysburg. On July 1st, Confederate troops clashed with Union forces just northwest of the town. The battle began almost by accident, but it would grow into the largest engagement ever fought on American soil. By the second day, both sides had dug in. Union soldiers held the high ground along Cemetery Ridge, while Confederates launched fierce assaults on the flanks. At places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheat Field, the air was thick with smoke, shouts, and cannon fire. Thousands fell, but the lines held. Then came July 3rd, and Lee's fateful gamble. He ordered Pickett's charge, sending 15,000 men across open fields toward the Union center. They marched shoulder-to-shoulder into a hailstorm of artillery and rifle fire. The charge was brave, but it was doomed. Few reached the Union line. Most never made it halfway. The Confederate army, battered and broken, began to retreat. Lee had lost over 28,000 men, a third of his army. The North had suffered as well, with 23,000 casualties. But they had held the line. Gettysburg was the turning point. The Confederate advance into the North was over. Lee would never invade Union territory again. The momentum, after years of bloody stalemate, had finally shifted. A few months later, President Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a national cemetery. His speech was only 2 minutes long, but it carried the weight of the war. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It became known as the Gettysburg Address, a quiet, powerful reminder of what was at stake. The fields of Gettysburg grew silent again. The fallen were buried. The survivors marched on, but the war was far from over, and the cost was still rising. By late 1863, the war was no longer about swift victories or grand strategy. It had become a slow, grinding struggle, measured not in miles gained, but in lives lost. Every battle took something that could never be replaced. In Chickamauga, Vicksburg, Chancellorsville, and the Wilderness, the fighting was relentless. Dense forests caught fire from cannon blasts, trapping wounded men in flames. Rivers ran red. Fields once used for planting crops became cemeteries. Soldiers wrote home describing horrors they couldn't fully explain. "I have seen things that will follow me to my grave." One wrote, "I don't sleep much anymore, not because of fear, but because of memory." The Union's campaign in the West, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, focused on total war, wearing down the Confederacy through constant pressure and overwhelming numbers. Grant earned a reputation as a butcher by some, but Lincoln saw what others didn't. He fought to win, not just to survive. Meanwhile, in the South, resources dwindled. Towns were raided, railroads destroyed, fields burned, families starved. The war was no longer just fought by armies. It was felt by every civilian. And still, letters traveled back and forth. A young Union soldier wrote to his mother, "I miss the sound of the wind in the wheat. Here there is only smoke and silence after the fighting." From the South, a woman wrote in her diary, "My youngest has not had shoes in months. I trade salt for flour. We hear the cannons at night." Both sides believed they were right. Both believed they had no choice. Yet, the cost was staggering. There were no antibiotics, no real anesthesia, no peace of mind. Cemeteries filled faster than they could be named. And still the war went on because neither side was willing to give up. Not yet. And in that refusal, the nation bled. By early 1865, the war was nearing its end, but it had not yet loosened its grip. The Confederacy was collapsing slowly and painfully. Its economy was in shambles. Railroads lay twisted and burned. Cities were emptying. Supplies were running out, and still, Confederate soldiers fought. Many shoeless, hungry, and exhausted, clinging to a cause that was slipping through their fingers. Meanwhile, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the South, not just fighting armies, but destroying the infrastructure that supported them. In his march to the sea, he burned crops, tore up railroads, and left behind a trail of ashes from Atlanta to Savannah. It was war made total, designed to break the South's will. In Virginia, General Ulysses Grant pressed relentlessly against General Robert E. Lee. For months, Grant laid siege to Petersburg, cutting off the last lifelines to the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee's forces were surrounded, outnumbered, and starving. Finally, in April 1865, the defenses crumbled. On April 2nd, Richmond fell. Confederate government officials fled. Fires consumed parts of the city. Confederate flags were lowered, and Union soldiers marched into the capital that had once symbolized the rebellion. Just a week later, on April 9th, Lee met Grant at a quiet village in Appomato's courthouse. The meeting was calm, almost solemn. Lee arrived in full-dress uniform. Grant in a mud-splattered coat. They spoke not as enemies, but as soldiers who understood the cost of what they had done. With dignity and restraint, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most important force. Grant allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and sidearms. He even offered them rations. There was no celebration, no humiliation, just silence. The war, at least on paper, was over. Within weeks, the remaining Confederate armies surrendered. Flags were furled, camps emptied, guns were laid down, never to be raised again. But though the fighting had stopped, the wounds remained. The country had survived, but it was broken. Rebuilding would take years. Healing would take generations. And just days after Lee's surrender, tragedy would strike again. This time, not on the battlefield, but in a quiet theater in Washington, D.C. The cannons had gone silent. The uniforms were folded away. The war was over, but the wounds of the Civil War didn't heal with surrender. Just 5 days after Lee's capitulation at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The shot echoed across the nation, not just the end of a man, but a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Lincoln had called for a gentle peace, a rebuilding with malice toward none, with charity for all. His death left the country uncertain, grieving, and deeply divided. The Reconstruction era that followed tried to knit the Union back together, but it was far from smooth. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights. But resistance came quickly and violently, especially in the South. New systems of oppression, black codes, Jim Crow laws, and voter suppression emerged in place of slavery. Freed men who had once dreamed of equality found themselves trapped in new forms of poverty and persecution. The scars were not only legal or political, they were emotional, etched into the American psyche. In cemeteries across the nation, mothers and fathers wept over graves. Over 620,000 Americans had died. Entire towns had lost every eligible man. Soldiers returned home missing limbs, carrying memories they rarely spoke of. And yet the war lived on, not through battles, but through symbols and stories. The Confederate flag still waves in parts of the country. Statues of generals were erected not just to remember, but to shape the narrative of the past. For some, these are reminders of heritage. For others, they are monuments to a rebellion born in defense of slavery. Even today, the arguments continue about history, about justice, about what the Civil War was truly fought for, and what it still means. The war shaped the nation's identity. It clarified who counted as American and who had to fight for the right to be seen. It didn't end with Appomattox. It echoes in protests, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in quiet conversations. The American Civil War was fought with rifles and cannons, but its legacy is carried in the hearts of generations. It was never just about the past. It was, and still is, about what kind of future this country wants to build. By the mid-15th century, the once mighty Byzantine Empire had become a fragile shadow of its former self. The empire that had once ruled vast territories across the Mediterranean now consisted of little more than the city of Constantinople and a handful of scattered territories. Yet within its walls still flickered the embers of a world that had once been Rome. Founded by Emperor Constantine the Great over 1,000 years earlier, Constantinople had long stood as the crown jewel of Christendom, a symbol of strength, learning, and divine authority. Its towering walls, golden domes, and sacred relics had withstood countless assaults. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Rus, and even Crusaders. Each time, the city survived, but time had worn it down. By 1453, the population had dwindled. Entire districts inside the city were empty and overgrown. Great churches and palaces had crumbled. The once bustling harbors were quiet. Trade had shifted elsewhere, and the coffers of the empire had run dry. The Byzantine army once feared, now numbered in the mere thousands. Its navy was practically non-existent. Still, the city endured. The man who sat on the throne in those final days was Emperor Constantine Zephin's Palaiologos, the last of a long imperial line tracing back to Rome. He ruled not with wealth or legions, but with dignity and resolve. Though his realm was small, his spirit was not. To the east, however, a powerful force was rising. The Ottoman Empire, under the rule of a young and ambitious sultan named Mehmed II, was closing in. Constantinople stood in the way of Ottoman expansion, a Christian stronghold surrounded on all sides by Muslim lands. For me, the city was not just a military target. It was a prize, a symbol, and a prophecy. Many believed Constantinople could not fall. Its walls had been invincible for centuries. But few realized how weak the city had truly become, and how determined the young sultan was to make history. And so, as spring approached in the year 1453, the stage was quietly being set. The city that had once ruled the world was about to face its final siege. In the east, a young ruler was preparing to make history. Mehmed II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, had ascended to the throne at just 19 years old. By 21, he was already a seasoned strategist, politically astute, and unshakably ambitious. But Mehmed didn't just want to expand the empire, he wanted to claim immortality. And for that, he had set his sights on one prize above all others: Constantinople. The ancient city was more than a political or military goal. It was the spiritual successor of Rome, a Christian stronghold and a symbol of enduring resistance. It had defied conquerors for over 1,000 years. But Mehmed believed its time had come and that he would be the one to bring it down. For years, the Ottomans had encircled the city like a tightening noose, taking nearby territories, building up naval power, and carefully preparing. Mehmed knew that brute force alone would not be enough. Constantinople's famed walls, 3 thick layers of stone and moat, had repelled countless invasions. So he turned to innovation. In his court arrived a man named Orban, a Hungarian engineer and master of gunpowder weapons. With Mehmed's full support, Orban constructed massive siege cannons, some so large they required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to move. The largest, known simply as the Basilic, could hurl stone projectiles over 1,000 each. As winter melted into spring, Mehmed gathered his forces. By April 1453, an army of over 80,000 soldiers, infantry, cavalry, janissaries, and engineers began to move toward the city. Along with them came siege weapons, ships, and supplies for a long campaign. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine the Old prepared his defenses. He had fewer than 7,000 men, including volunteers and mercenaries. The odds were staggering. Yet, he would not abandon the city. To Constantine, Constantinople was not just his home. It was the last stand of the Christian East, the heart of an empire, and a sacred trust passed down through generations of emperors. And to Mehmed, it was a jewel he intended to claim. The siege was no longer a matter of if, but when. And the young sultan was ready. For over 1,000 years, the walls of Theodosius had stood as a symbol of Constantinople's invincibility. Originally constructed in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, these legendary fortifications wrapped around the city like a stone shield, towering layers of defense that had repelled countless enemies. With 3 massive walls, reinforced towers, and a deep moat, they stretched for nearly 4 miles across the western edge of the city. Generations of invaders had tried and failed to breach them. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Rus, even the fearsome armies of the Crusades had struggled to overcome them. And now, in 1453, the walls would be tested one final time. When Mehmed's army arrived outside the gates of Constantinople in early April, he ordered his men to set up a massive siege encampment. Tents spread across the rolling hills like a sea of color. Siege towers, trenches, and cannons were positioned within striking distance of the land walls. Then the bombardment began. Mehmed's enormous basilic cannon unleashed thunderous blasts, firing stone balls that smashed against the walls with terrifying force. Day after day, the earth shook beneath the defenders' feet. Stone cracked. Dust filled the air. Still, the walls held. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine the Defenders worked tirelessly, repairing breaches by night, redistributing men across the battlements, and reinforcing weak points with rubble and wood. They had no choice but to endure. The walls had always been Constantinople's greatest defense. But now they were being systematically dismantled by gunpowder, a weapon of a new age. At the same time, the sea walls along the Golden Horn remained secure, protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the harbor. Behind it sat the city's small Byzantine fleet and a few allied Genoese ships. As long as the harbor was closed, a naval assault seemed impossible. Still, Mehmed watched, calculated, planned. He understood that to take Constantinople, he had to break its spine, those legendary walls. And if the land approach couldn't bring a swift victory, he would find another way in. The siege dragged on, and the defenders, outnumbered and isolated, wondered how much longer they could hold. For weeks, the walls of Constantinople had held. Though battered by Mehmed's massive cannons, the defenders had repelled wave after wave of assaults. The morale inside the city remained high, even as the odds grew darker. The land walls were damaged, but not breached. The Golden Horn, the city's protected northern harbor, remained closed, sealed shut by the heavy iron chain stretching across its entrance. Behind that chain floated the last hope of the Byzantines, a small defensive fleet and a few vital Genoese ships. As long as the Golden Horn remained secure, the city could not be surrounded. But Mehmed had no intention of waiting forever. Then came one of the most brilliant and audacious moves in siege warfare. On the night of April 21st, 1453, under cover of darkness and the hum of anticipation, the Ottomans began to move their ships over land. Using greased wooden logs as rollers, engineers and laborers hauled dozens of warships out of the Bosphorus, over the hills behind Galata, and into the calm waters of the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the chain. It was an impossible sight. By morning, the citizens of Constantinople looked out from the walls and saw something they could hardly believe. Ottoman warships had appeared inside their supposedly impenetrable harbor. Panic spread like wildfire. Now the city was surrounded on all sides by land and sea. The defenders had to divide their already thin forces to cover the new naval threat. Cannon fire came from every direction. Arrows and flaming bolts lit up the sky. Constantinople was no longer facing a siege. It was facing total encirclement. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine ordered desperate countermeasures. Ships rushed to defend the harbor. Fireships were launched to try and burn the Ottoman vessels, and chains were reinforced. The damage had already been done, not just tactically, but psychologically. Mehmed's bold maneuver had broken the defenders' sense of security. The message was clear: nowhere was safe. The city's famed walls were still standing, but Constantinople's isolation had become complete. And as the pressure mounted, the siege entered its final, most desperate phase. In the heart of a crumbling empire stood a man who refused to yield. Constantine the Finta Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, was not a ruler of grand palaces or vast armies. He commanded a dying empire, a city more than a nation. Yet in the twilight of Rome's thousand-year legacy, he stood with quiet resolve. He was not surrounded by luxury, but by ruin. Much of Constantinople lay abandoned. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. The empire's last possessions had been pawned for weapons, food, and soldiers. Still, Constantine ruled not with gold, but with dignity and loyalty. Day after day, he walked among the people. He dined with soldiers. He prayed with priests, and he led not from a throne, but from the battlements. As the siege worsened, desperation grew. Constantine sent urgent messages to the west, begging for help from fellow Christian kingdoms. A few ships arrived, mostly from Genoa and Venice, brave volunteers who slipped past Ottoman blockades to join the defense. But the great armies of Europe never came. Political divisions, old grudges, and distance dulled the West response. Still, the emperor did not abandon hope. In a symbolic and powerful act, Constantine reopened Hagia Sophia, not just for Orthodox Christians, but for Catholics as well. For the first time in centuries, the divided branches of Christianity worshiped together inside the great cathedral. Bitter theological debates were set aside. In the face of extinction, unity mattered more than doctrine. Inside the ancient walls of Hagia Sophia, under its vast golden dome, they held a final divine liturgy. Candles flickered, incense rose, and the city prayed not for victory, but for peace, for courage, and for the souls of those who would soon perish. Emperor Constantine stood among them, not as a distant monarch, but as a man. knowing full well that he might not survive the coming dawn. In the darkness, he made his final preparations. He gathered his generals, he spoke to his soldiers, and he made a vow that he would die defending his city, his people, and the memory of a civilization that had once ruled the world. The sun set on May 28, 1453, for what would be the last time over a Byzantine Constantinople. Within the city's worn walls, a hush fell, an eerie, sacred quiet that blanketed the streets like mist. Everyone knew the final assault was coming with the morning. The Ottoman bombardment had grown heavier in the previous days, and the breaches in the walls were widening. Patrols reported signs of mass movement in the enemy camps. The storm was about to break. Inside the imperial palace and the quarters of the commoners alike, the people prepared not just for battle, but for farewell. By nightfall, Emperor Constantine the Fez gathered his remaining generals and nobles. His voice was steady as he gave a speech that would echo through the ages. He thanked them, not as subjects, but as brothers in arms. He asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged. And then he gave them one final order: to fight and die with honor. There would be no surrender. He reminded them that they were not merely defending a city, but the soul of an empire, the last breath of Rome. And that history would remember them, not for surviving, but for standing when no one else would. Elsewhere, the people gathered in the great cathedral Hagia Sophia under its golden dome, now dimly lit with candles. Priests, monks, soldiers, mothers, and children filled the vast space. Orthodox and Catholic, merchant and beggar, side by side. Voices rose in prayer, not for deliverance, but for strength. Some wept, others stared in silence. A few smiled through tears, holding loved ones close. Outside the walls, the Ottoman camp was alive with energy. Fires burned in long rows. Drums beat a steady, ominous rhythm. Soldiers sharpened blades. Cannons were prepared for one last barrage. In his command tent, Sultan Mehmed II reviewed his plans. Every division had its orders, every cannon its target. He believed the city would fall by midday. Back within the walls, Constantine, wearing plain armor without royal insignia, mounted the walls and looked out at the enemy camp. He crossed himself quietly, then descended to his post at the weakest part of the wall. There would be no sleep that night, only waiting. Before dawn broke on May 29, 1453, the Ottoman cannons roared once more. The final assault had begun. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers charged the shattered sections of the land walls. First came the Bashi bazooks, the irregulars, poorly trained, expendable, and sent to exhaust the defenders. Then came the Anatolian troops, more disciplined and heavily armed. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XV, fought with desperation and fury. Greek and Genoese soldiers rained arrows, hurled stones, and poured boiling oil from the battlements. For a time, they held their ground, but the Ottomans kept coming. Then came the Janissaries, Sultan Mehmed's elite guard. Fresh, disciplined, and relentless, they surged toward the most damaged part of the wall, the Gate of St. Romanos, where weeks of bombardment had left a massive breach. In the chaos of the fighting, tragedy struck. A small side gate known as the Kerkopora had been left unlocked, likely by mistake. A group of Ottoman soldiers discovered it, slipped inside, and raised the crescent flag atop one of the inner towers. Panic spread through the city. With enemies now behind the walls, the defense crumbled. Emperor Constantine, refusing to flee, removed his imperial regalia and joined the meal as a common soldier. According to legend, his final words were, "The city is lost, but I live." He charged into the fray and was never seen again. As the Ottomans poured through the breaches, the defenders broke ranks. Some fought to the death. Others retreated toward the harbors or sought refuge in churches. Blood ran in the streets. The cries of the wounded echoed off the ancient stones. By midday, the last resistance had been crushed. The city that had withstood centuries of siege had finally fallen. Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople through the gate of Karasis. His soldiers lined the streets, cheering, but the Sultan remained silent, gazing upon the city with solemn pride. He had done what no one before him could. The city was his. After 123 years, the last great outpost of the Roman Empire, the Second Rome, had fallen. The ancient world had drawn its final breath. As the Ottoman flag rose above Constantinople, the ancient city descended into chaos. For 3 days, according to the custom of conquest, the victorious Ottoman soldiers were given free rein. The fall of the city was not just military, it was human. Looting and plunder began almost immediately. Homes were ransacked, churches were pillaged, and ancient relics were torn from their resting places. The proud streets of Constantinople, once lined with mosaics, markets, and scholars, echoed now with screams. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, hundreds of civilians had sought sanctuary. Mothers clutched their children. Priests clung to icons. Many believed a divine miracle would protect them. But when the Ottoman soldiers arrived, the doors were forced open. The sacred marble floor was trampled. The golden dome, once glittering with centuries of faith, shook with the sound of weapons. Men were killed. Women and children were taken into slavery. The cross atop the cathedral was torn down. And yet, the church itself was spared from destruction. On the afternoon of May 29th, Sultan Mehmed II entered the city. He did not arrive with fire or fury. He rode solemnly through the broken gates and into the heart of the fallen empire. Upon reaching Hagia Sophia, he dismounted, walked inside, and stood beneath its towering dome in silence. He ordered the looting to stop. Then, in a symbolic gesture of conquest and transformation, he bowed toward Mecca and prayed. The sacred Christian cathedral would now become a mosque. Its walls would remain, but its purpose had changed. Mehmed was no ordinary conqueror. He was a man of vision and calculation. Though Constantinople had been claimed through war, he sought to rebuild it, not destroy it. He ordered the protection of surviving citizens, and within days, craftsmen, scholars, and administrators were brought in from across the empire to restore the city's function as a capital. The name Constantinople remained in use, but it slowly began to fade in everyday speech. The city was now part of something new, a bridge between East and West, between Islam and Christianity, between the ancient world and the modern one. The sack had ended, but a new era had begun. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than the loss of a city. It was the end of an era. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, the final remnant of the Roman world. It had stood as a symbol of Christian power, Roman law, Greek learning, and imperial legacy. Its golden mosaics, libraries, and cathedrals represented the soul of a civilization that had outlived its Western twin by nearly a millennium. And now it was gone. The death of Constantine V, the last Roman emperor, marked the closing of a lineage that traced back to Augustus Caesar. His disappearance in the final charge gave birth to legend. Some said he lived, spirited away to return one day and reclaim the city. But history had moved on. Under Sultan Mehmed II, Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul, the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The city, scarred but not destroyed, began to pulse again with life. Mosques rose beside old churches. Markets thrived. Scholars, artists, and traders from across the Muslim world filled its streets. Mehmed embraced the legacy of the city he had conquered. He took the title Caesar of Rome, claiming not just territory, but continuity. To him, the Ottoman sultans were heirs to the Roman emperors, carriers of civilization. In the West, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves. Christian Europe, once complacent, was shaken awake. The Eastern Orthodox world was now without a capital, and Greek scholars, fleeing the city's fall, carried their manuscripts to Italy, where their arrival helped ignite the Renaissance. The city's fall also reshaped global trade. With land routes through the east under Ottoman control, European kingdoms began to search for sea routes, eventually leading to the age of exploration and the rise of powers like Spain, Portugal, and later Britain. But even centuries later, the memory of Constantinople lingers in its streets where east meets west, in its layered architecture, in the name itself, whispered with reverence by historians, dreamers, and descendants of a fallen empire. It did not vanish. It transformed from Christian Rome to Muslim Istanbul. From imperial capital to modern megacity, Constantinople lives on. A bridge between worlds, a city of memory, a name written in the stones of time. The samurai did not begin as noble heroes or romanticized warriors. They were born out of necessity, a response to chaos. In the 9th century, the imperial court in Kyoto was beginning to lose control. Though the emperor still ruled in name, his reach no longer extended to the far edges of Japan. In the provinces, landowning nobles called daimyo began to act as independent rulers. They collected taxes, governed villages, and most importantly, hired armed men to protect their lands. These warriors, skilled with bow and sword, would evolve into a class known as the samurai. At first, they were little more than private militias. But as the centuries passed, their role deepened. They were not just fighters. They became defenders of order, enforcers of clan law, and symbols of authority in a land increasingly divided by civil strife. Japan was fracturing. Rival clans clashed for territory, and power often changed hands through blood, not ballots. Out of this turbulence, the samurai rose not just as tools of war, but as a class of their own. By the late Han period, 794–1185, the samurai had become indispensable. They formed the backbone of military power. Their loyalty once to the emperor shifted to their clan leaders, the daimyo, and to each other. It was in this era that two great warrior families, the Taira and the Minamoto, rose to prominence. Their conflict would lead to the Geni War, a brutal civil war that reshaped the nation and brought the first shogun to power. But even before the politics, before the titles, the samurai already held something far deeper, an identity. They trained relentlessly, not just in combat, but in mental discipline. They lived by unwritten codes of loyalty, restraint, and duty. And though their armor was lacquered and their swords razor sharp, they often lived humbly, close to the land and far from the luxuries of the capital. This was not the age of fantasy, but the foundation of something enduring. What began as armed men on horseback was slowly becoming a way of life, and the world of feudal Japan would never be the same again. As the samurai rose in power, so too did the need for something to guide them, not just in battle, but in life. Out of centuries of warfare, discipline, and tradition, a moral compass began to form. It was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was never a single written doctrine. It was a living code shaped by Buddhist calm, Confucian loyalty, and Shinto purity. It demanded more than strength. It asked for character. At its core were 7 virtues: rectitude, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. To the samurai, these weren't ideals, they were obligations. A warrior had to act with justice, even when it was inconvenient. He had to be fearless in the face of death. He was expected to be generous to the weak, respectful to the wise, and brutally honest with himself. But above all else, he had to be loyal to his lord, to his family, and to his name. Failure to live by Bushido brought shame, not just personal, but communal. To die with honor was preferable to living in disgrace. This is why the practice of seppuku, ritual suicide, was so revered. If a samurai was captured, betrayed his lord, or committed a serious transgression, he could take his own life to cleanse his soul and restore his family's honor. It was a death with dignity, a final act of control in a world ruled by chaos. But Bushido wasn't all steel and sorrow. It also called for kindness, especially to the defenseless. Samurai was a protector of the people, not a tyrant. He was expected to be humble, well-read, and emotionally restrained. In battle, he fought with precision. At home, he studied poetry and practiced stillness. This balance between the sword and the soul was what separated a true samurai from a mere killer. Bushido turned warfare into philosophy. It turned violence into a matter of honor. And over time, this quiet code spoken in actions more than words would become the soul of the samurai class. Even centuries after their decline, Bushido remains. Not just in history books, but in the way Japan remembers what it means to live with discipline, grace, and unwavering purpose. To the samurai, the sword was not just a weapon. It was the heart of their identity. The katana, with its graceful curve and single-edged blade, was more than steel. It was said to hold the soul of the warrior. Forged over weeks by master smiths, the blade was folded hundreds of times, purified and quenched with ritual precision. The process was sacred. The result, a weapon as beautiful as it was deadly. Samurai often carried two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. Together, they formed the daisho, symbolizing the unity of strength and discipline. But owning a sword was not enough. It had to be mastered. From childhood, samurai trained in kenjutsu, the art of the sword. Every movement was deliberate. Every strike was designed not only to defeat, but to reflect inner control. To hesitate was to die. To act without intention was to dishonor the blade. Combat was as much about mental stillness as physical skill. Many samurai embraced Zen Buddhism, which taught that the mind must be clear, detached, and free from fear. In the silence before a duel, in the breath before a strike, there was no past or future, only presence. This spiritual balance shaped their fighting style. Samurai didn't flail or rage. They moved with calm precision like wind through a forest. It was this fusion of steel and serenity that made them so feared and so respected. Off the battlefield, swords were never drawn without cause. To unshath a blade was to accept the possibility of death, either for one's enemy or for oneself. A samurai might live his whole life without using his katana, but he would die before dishonoring it. Swords were passed down through generations, wrapped in cloth, guarded with reverence. In some families, a sword was considered more sacred than a temple relic. Even in death, the sword remained close. Samurai were often buried with their blades, a final gesture of loyalty to the soul they had lived by. In the end, the sword was more than a tool of war. It was a mirror shining back the discipline, humility, and spirit of the man who carried it. As Japan drifted further from the control of its imperial court, real power fell into the hands of those who could raise armies. Not just with gold, but with loyalty and fear. Across the country, powerful families known as clans rose to prominence. These clans, each led by a daimyo, controlled vast stretches of land. Their banners flew high over valleys, mountains, and coastal strongholds. And beneath those banners served thousands of samurai. Among these rising families, two would shape the course of Japan's future: the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was generational. Political marriages, betrayals, and shifting alliances fueled a growing fire. And when the flames finally erupted, they ignited the nation in the Geni War, from 1180 to 1185. The Taira and Minamoto fought bitterly for control. Samurai clashed across fields and rivers under red and white banners. Entire provinces burned. Each victory brought new treachery. Each defeat gave birth to legend. It was during this time that the image of the samurai, both feared and poetic, was truly born. The final battle came at Dan Nura, a naval clash where the Minamoto dealt a crushing blow to the Taira. Their young emperor, only 6 years old, was drowned by his own grandmother to prevent his capture. With that, the Taira were gone. Victory gave rise to a new order. In 1192, the leader of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was granted the title of shogun, military ruler of Japan. The emperor remained in Kyoto, still divine in name, but stripped of real power. A new government, the shogunate, was born. Founded on the sword, upheld by the loyalty of samurai, and driven by the ambitions of rival clans. Over time, other families would rise and fall. The Hojo, the Ashikaga, the Taira, and the Wasugi. Each fought for dominance. Each carried with them warriors trained from birth, shaped by Bushido, and ready to die at their master's word. Feudal Japan was no longer ruled by ideals. It was ruled by alliances, armies, and the ever-turning wheel of war. And the samurai stood at the center of it all, both as shields and as swords. For the samurai, war was always near, but peace was never wasted. When not riding into battle or serving their daimyo, samurai lived lives defined by discipline, duty, and preparation. Even in quiet seasons, their world was shaped by the possibility of conflict. They did not relax. They refined. Daily life began early. Training in swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship remained essential. But just as important were skills of the mind. Samurai practiced calligraphy, literature, poetry, and strategy. A warrior had to be as thoughtful as he was deadly. The greatest among them balanced strength with subtlety. Children born into samurai families were taught to endure pain, obey orders without hesitation, and show respect at all times. Even a simple bow carried meaning, measured, practiced, and precise. Manners were not just etiquette. They were an expression of inner discipline. In the home, a samurai's life was austere. Clothing was plain but clean. Meals were simple: rice, vegetables, and fish. Wastefulness was frowned upon. Every action had purpose. Every word was weighed. They lived with the awareness that death could come at any moment, not with fear, but with readiness. A samurai was taught never to cling to life, but to fulfill his duty, no matter the cost. In their rare moments of peace, many practiced the tea ceremony or chinoyo, a quiet ritual of boiling water, preparing matcha and serving guests with grace. To outsiders, it seemed delicate. But to the samurai, it was another battlefield where attention to detail, humility, and presence of mind were tested. Others found meaning in ink painting, composing haiku, or sitting in meditation under trees. In these simple acts, they connected to the impermanence of life, a central theme in both Zen and samurai philosophy. But even in stillness, they remained alert. Spies could be anywhere. Loyalty was fragile. Clans shifted. Allies betrayed. A samurai might host a guest at his table one night and face him across the battlefield the next. So they lived with grace, but with guarded hearts. In the shadow of war, the samurai carved a life of honor, precision, and awareness. Every breath was a preparation. Every day, a quiet rehearsal for the final moment. The samurai lived in a world of discipline and steel, but also of spirits, rituals, and unseen forces. They believed life was not separate from the spiritual realm. Every mountain, tree, and stream could house a kami, a divine spirit from Japan's ancient Shinto tradition. These spirits were not distant gods, but living presences that could bring protection, fortune, or calamity. Before battles, samurai visited shrines, bowed before sacred torii gates, and prayed for strength and guidance. Offerings of rice, sake, or incense were made not out of superstition, but respect for the world they could not see. Many warriors also followed Zen Buddhism, a spiritual path emphasizing silence, simplicity, and awareness. Zen taught that truth was found not through words, but through direct experience. In the stillness of meditation, a samurai trained his mind to be calm, unshaken by fear, free from anger, and focused in the present moment. This mental clarity was essential in battle. The perfect strike came not from brute strength, but from a quiet mind. But the samurai world was not only divine, it was also haunted. They believed in your restless spirits of the dead. Warriors who died with hatred or regret were said to return, unable to cross into the afterlife. Their presence was felt in cold winds, flickering lamps, and whispers on the edge of sleep. Some samurai carried protective talismans or war symbols hidden beneath their armor. Charms to ward off spirits, bad luck, and curses. Even the bravest warrior did not ignore the world beyond. Legends of kitsune, fox spirits that could shapeshift and deceive, circulated among campfires. Stories of Tennu, bird-like creatures said to live in the mountains, were shared in whispers. These beings were not just folklore. They were part of the samurai's spiritual reality. Life and death, seen and unseen, were interwoven. Samurai were taught to face both with equal calm. To walk through forests with reverence. To fight without fear of ghosts. To die knowing their spirit, too, might linger unless their death was honorable. Their duty fulfilled. In the world of the samurai, the sword was sharp, but the soul walked softly through a land of shadows. In the 13th century, the greatest empire the world had ever seen turned its gaze toward Japan. The Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan had already conquered China and Korea. Now the Khan demanded submission from Japan's ruler, the shogunate in Kamakura. When the Japanese refused, the Mongols prepared for war. In 1274, an invasion force of nearly 30,000 men sailed from Korea. The samurai waited on the shores of Kyushu, not knowing what to expect. The Mongols fought differently, using tight formations, explosive gunpowder bombs, and iron-tipped arrows fired in volleys. The samurai trained for ritualized duels and honor-bound combat were stunned, but the Japanese held their ground. After a day of fierce fighting, the Mongols retreated to their ships. Then that night, a violent storm struck the fleet. Hundreds of ships were shattered against the rocks. Thousands of soldiers drowned in the dark sea. The storm, the Japanese believed, was no accident. It was the work of the gods. They called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. Kublai was not finished. In 1281, he launched a second invasion, this time with over 140,000 men, one of the largest amphibious forces in history. The Japanese, better prepared, had built coastal defenses. For weeks, they fought desperately to hold back the tide. And then the winds rose again. A second, even greater typhoon struck the Mongol fleet. Ships were smashed, scattered, and sunk. Survivors were hunted on shore. Once more, the invasion failed, not because of the sword, but because of the sea. To the samurai, it was more than luck. It was divine proof of their purpose, a sacred duty to protect Japan, not just with their weapons, but with their lives. The Mongol invasions left a deep mark. The cost of defense drained the shogunate coffers. Samurai promised rewards received little. Resentment grew. The seeds of future unrest were sown. But the legacy of the kamikaze endured. It became a symbol of protection of the land's spiritual shield. A reminder that even against the greatest force on earth, Japan, through discipline, sacrifice, and fate, had endured, not by sword alone, but by the wind. For centuries, the samurai had lived by the sword, serving lords, shaping politics, and defending the honor of their clans. But even the strongest steel dulls over time. By the early 1600s, Japan entered a new era of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. After generations of war and instability, the country was unified once more. The capital moved to Edo, now Tokyo. The daimyo were brought under strict control, and with peace, the samurai's purpose began to shift. No longer called to battle, many samurai became bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars. They still wore their swords and kept their rank, but their lives were increasingly filled with scrolls instead of skirmishes. For some, this was a welcome change. They studied literature, refined the tea ceremony, and helped govern a nation rising in stability and culture. But for others, the absence of war was a quiet torment. A warrior without battle, a blade without an enemy. Their code, Bushido, remained, but the world around it was changing. In the mid-19th century, everything shifted again. Commodore Perry arrived from America in 1853, demanding Japan open its ports to trade. The Tokugawa government, unable to resist Western pressure, signed unequal treaties. Dissatisfaction spread. The emperor, long a symbolic figure, began to reclaim real power. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. The emperor was restored. The shogunate was abolished, and with it, the samurai class was dismantled. New laws stripped them of their privileges. The right to carry swords in public was banned. Their stipends disappeared. Many were forced to find new lives as teachers, merchants, or military officers in a modernizing army. Some accepted the change. Others resisted, fighting in brief rebellions, including the famous Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, one of the last great samurai. It ended in defeat, marking the final stand of the old warrior class. The samurai as a social class had fallen, but their spirit was not gone. Their values, discipline, loyalty, self-sacrifice, remained woven into the fabric of modern Japan. Even in defeat, they were transformed, reborn into something timeless, not bound by armor or rank, but remembered in silence and carried forward in soul. The age of the samurai is gone. Their castles have fallen silent. Their swords rest behind glass. Their banners no longer fly on the wind, and yet their presence has never truly left Japan. In every bow of respect, in every cup of tea served with care, in every act of quiet discipline, you can still feel the echo of the samurai spirit. Their values did not die with the end of their class. Instead, they flowed into the veins of modern Japan. Loyalty to purpose, dedication to mastery, and honor in action. The essence of Bushido lives on in the way students study, artists create, and craftsmanship with precision. Their stories became legend. Writers and poets kept their memory alive. Painters and woodblock artists captured their elegance and resolve. In the 20th century, filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa turned their lives into timeless cinema, bringing to the world the silent intensity of Ronin, the lonely roads of exiled warriors, and the beauty of a sword drawn only when needed. Even in modern martial arts, kendo, iaido, judo, the rituals remain: bows before combat, clean movements, mutual respect. Every kata, every step is a tribute to those who lived by the sword in spirit. Globally, the samurai became a symbol of restraint in power, of discipline without cruelty, of grace under pressure. In a world that often moves too fast, the image of a lone samurai beneath cherry blossoms reminds us to slow down, to move with purpose, and to hold ourselves with quiet dignity. They were not perfect. Like all warriors, they lived in times of violence and contradiction. But within their lives lay something universal, a search for meaning through mastery, through loyalty, through self-control. That's why they remain with us, not in armor or rank, but in principle. They are shadows cast not in darkness, but in memory. Soft reminders of a time when a single man with a sword at his side and a code in his heart could shape the world around him. The samurai are gone, but their spirit still walks the mountain paths, bows before the shrine, and lingers in the stillness before the storm.